The orchestra was mid-swing when the laughter began. Not the warm laughter of a satisfied crowd. Not the kind that rides along with brass and piano. This laughter cut through the music, inside a Harlem nightclub glowing under low amber lights. Glasses shimmered against polished tables. Cigarette smoke drifted lazily toward the ceiling. The band was locked in rhythm, horns rising and falling like a heartbeat. And at the center of it all sat Duke Ellington, composed, immaculate, untouchable in presence. His fingers moved across the keys with surgical precision, each note deliberate, each pause intentional. Then the interruption came again, louder this time. A man near the front leaned back in his chair, boots stretched out too far, confidence spilling from him like cheap cologne. He wore power openly, rings heavy on his fingers, silk tie loose at the collar. A local mobster, not Harlem-born but Harlem-present, the kind of man who believed territory could be measured by how loudly he spoke inside it. He said something sharp, soft and dismissive. A few nervous chuckles followed from his table. No one else joined that. The band faltered. For a brief second, the music tried to recover, but rhythm requires unity, and unity had just been fractured. Ellington's hand slowed. He did not look angry. He did not look afraid. He simply looked aware, because this was not about music. It was about control. Harlem in those years was more than nightlife. It was influence disguised as entertainment. Culture that generated revenue. Revenue that generated power. And power always attracts challengers. The mobster lifted his glass again, smirking toward the stage as if daring someone to object. No one moved. Waiters froze mid-step. A woman in a pearl dress lowered her eyes. Musicians avoided direct contact. Everyone understood what was happening. If Harlem's greatest artist could be embarrassed publicly, without consequence, then Harlem itself could be diminished. The door at the back of the club opened, and no dramatic slam, no announcement, just a shift in the air. Some say the temperature in the room changed. Others believe it was simply awareness. The instinctive reaction people have when authority enters quietly. Bumpy Johnson stepped inside, hat tilted slightly forward, coat tailored but unflashy, expression unreadable. He did not rush. He did not scan for attention. He walked as if the room already belonged to him. Some say he had been informed minutes earlier that a runner had whispered the insult into his ear on the sidewalk outside. Others believe he arrived by coincidence, drawn by instincts, the way seasoned predators sense imbalance. He stopped near the mobster's table. The laughter faded. The mobster looked up slowly, smiled, but thinner now. Evening, he muttered. Casual but testing. Bumpy did not reply. Silence settled over them like weight. He removed his gloves carefully, one finger at a time. No sudden movements, no raised voice. Just deliberate control, because men like Bumpy understood something fundamental. Volume is weakness, precision is power. The mobster shifted in his chair. His men straightened subtly, calculating distances, calculating exits. Then Bumpy reached into his coat pocket. Time slowed. No. One breathed. He did not draw a gun. That would have been expected. Instead, he produced a straight razor, closed, silver, polished enough to reflect the dim chandelier light. Above, he held it gently between two fingers, not threatening, not waving, just visible. The message was clear. A gun creates chaos. A razor requires proximity. It suggested something far more personal than gunfire. It meant consequences would not be distant or theatrical. They would be quiet, close, controlled. Some say Bumpy leaned down slightly and whispered a sentence only. The mobster could hear. Others insist no words were spoken at all. But whatever passed between them shifted everything. The mobster's smirk disappeared. His jaw tightened. He understood that escalation would not benefit him. Not here, not tonight. Not over a moment meant to test boundaries, because this was Harlem, and Harlem already had its guardian. After a long pause, the mobster leaned back. Hands visible on the table, a concession. Small, subtle, but undeniable. Bumpy held the razor 1 second longer, just enough for memory to burn the image into every witness in that room. Then he folded it closed, slipped it back into his pocket, and without looking at the stage, he gave the slightest nod. Ellington resumed playing the piano, returned first, soft, controlled, then the horns followed, stronger this time, almost defiant. The crowd exhaled as one. The night continued, but it was no longer the same night. No punches thrown, no blood spilled, no police called. Yet everyone present would remember it for years, because in a city ruled by noise, one man had restored order with silence. And in that silence, Harlem remembered exactly who it answered to, long before the razor ever caught the light of a Harlem chandelier. Before whispers turned into legend, Bumpy Johnson had already built something far more powerful than fear. He had built reputation. And reputation, in the underworld, is currency that never devalues. He was not born into Harlem royalty. He arrived in New York carrying little more than instinct and observation. The streets did not welcome newcomers gently. They tested them, measured them, pushed them toward corners to see how they would respond. Some men reacted loudly. Bumpy reacted quietly. He watched first. Harlem in the 1930s was a contradiction. By day, brownstones and storefronts pulsed with ambition. By night, jazz spilled from clubs like liquid gold. Writers, musicians, and thinkers shaped a cultural renaissance that would echo across America. But beneath that brilliance was another system. Numbers, running, protection networks, quiet deals made in back rooms thick with cigar smoke, power layered under poetry. Bumpy understood early that survival required more than strength. It required calculation. Some say he spent nights reading philosophy while others gambled. Others believed that image was exaggerated over time to elevate his myth. But those who dealt with him agreed on one thing. He thought differently. He did not rush decisions. He did not overreact. He studied men the way chess players study opponents, watching patterns, recognizing weaknesses before they became visible to anyone else. He worked under powerful figures during his rise, learning how influence moved through the city, how alliances were formed, how betrayal was often less dramatic than people imagined, sometimes just a missed payment, a delayed favor, a quiet shift in loyalty. Violence existed in that world. It always did. But Bumpy treated it as a last calculation, not a first impulse. Because brute force attracts enemies, intelligence builds leverage. Business owners in Harlem began to notice something different about him. He was firm, but predictable. Agreements were honored. Protection meant protection. Musicians could perform without interruption. Clubs could operate without constant fear of random disruption. Order creates trust, and trust creates power. Some rivals underestimated him at first. They saw a man who did not shout, who did not parade with unnecessary muscle, who did not seek headlines. They mistook calm for softness. They learned quickly that calm can be deliberate. Stories began to circulate. Not loud stories, not public ones, quiet accounts shared between men who respected survival, a dispute resolved without chaos, a territory maintained without open war, a negotiation won without visible threats. Bumpy's strength was not intimidation alone. It was presence. When he entered a room, conversations adjusted slightly. People chose their words more carefully, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it. He understood something fundamental about Harlem. Culture was power. Jazz clubs were not just entertainment venues. They were economic engines, social hubs, symbols of identity. Protecting them meant protecting revenue, protecting pride. And pride, once fractured, is difficult to repair. That is why the night Duke Ellington was challenged mattered so deeply. It was not about personal insult, it was about balance. By the time that confrontation unfolded, Bumpy had already spent years maintaining a delicate equilibrium between Harlem's internal structure and the external forces pressing against it, particularly larger organized crime families who saw opportunity in Harlem's success. He navigated those relationships carefully. Cooperation when profitable, resistance when necessary. Some say he operated like a diplomat disguised as a gangster. Others insist he was something more calculated, a strategist who understood that survival in New York required adaptation. He knew open war would destroy Harlem faster than any insult ever could, so he avoided it. But he also knew that unchecked disrespect invites takeover. That is the line he walked every day. Measured strength, controlled response. By the time he stepped into that nightclub and faced the mocking laughter directed at Duke Ellington, his reaction was not spontaneous emotion. It was policy, it was principle, it was years of observation distilled into a single gesture. The razor was not drawn in anger, it was drawn in defense of order, and that order had been carefully constructed, layer by layer, long before anyone in that club realized they were standing inside it. By the early 1940s, Harlem was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a statement. The streets carried rhythm. The clubs carried influence. And the name Duke Ellington echoed far beyond New York. Orchestra did not simply perform music, it exported identity. It turned Harlem into a destination where culture flourishes, money follows, and where money flows, power arrives to claim it. Downtown Manhattan had long been controlled by structured crime families, organized, disciplined, and deeply strategic. They studied neighborhoods the way investors study markets. Harlem was no longer overlooked. It was assessed that some alliances were formed quietly, shared profits, agreed territories, cooperation that benefited both sides. But cooperation has limits. As Harlem's nightlife grew more profitable, certain figures began to test how much control they could exert without open conflict. Encroachment rarely begins with war. It begins with small signals, a delayed payment, a new face managing a door, a subtle shift in who collects and who protects. The mobster who mocked Ellington that night was not acting in isolation. Whether he knew it or not, he represented pressure from beyond Harlem's borders. Pressure to see how elastic the boundaries really were. Some say he had back-in from downtown interests. Others insist he was simply arrogant too, confident in borrowed territory. But arrogance itself can be strategic. If Harlem's most respected musician could be humiliated publicly, without consequence, it would send a message far louder than any gunshot. It would say, the guardians of this neighborhood are symbolic, not real. That is how control erodes, not all at once, but in moments. Bumpy Johnson understood that pattern better than most. He had watched other neighborhoods lose autonomy through gradual concessions, small compromises justified as temporary, partnerships that slowly became dependence that became absorption. He knew Harlem could not afford that trajectory. The genius of Harlem was its independence, its ability to generate culture without permission, to build identity without outside validation. But independence must be protected, not loudly, not recklessly, but firmly. The mob families downtown operated like corporations, structured hierarchies, clear chains of command, calculated expansion. Harlem's underworld was different, more personal, more localized, more rooted in community relationships. That difference was both strength and vulnerability, because corporations absorb neighborhoods through contracts. Communities defend themselves through loyalty. The nightclub incident was a probe, whether intentional or not, a small test to measure reaction time, to see whether Harlem would respond with chaos, weakness, or precision. Respond with chaos, and it justifies intervention. Respond with weakness, and it invites takeover. Precision, however, complicates expansion. Some say Bumpy had already sensed growing pressure weeks before the incident, that he noticed unfamiliar faces lingering near clubs, that certain negotiations began to feel slightly tilted. Others believe the insult itself triggered his full awareness. Either way, the stakes were clear to him immediately. This was not about protecting one man's pride, it was about preventing precedent. Because once precedent is established, reversal becomes costly. If Duke Ellington could be embarrassed in front of his own audience, what would stop future disruptions? What would prevent outside forces from dictating which musicians played, which owners paid, which doors stayed open? Cultural humiliation is rarely accidental. It is leverage. And leverage, once applied, tightens. Bumpy's entire strategy in Harlem had been built on equilibrium, balancing cooperation with resistance, allowing profit sharing where necessary, but drawing invisible lines around autonomy. That night, one of those lines was crossed. The response required subtlety. A gun would have escalated matters into something public, something messy, something that forced downtown bosses to respond. But a razor displayed, not used, was different. It was personal without being explosive. It communicated seriousness without inviting full-scale retaliation. And that is why the encroachment stalled. Not because it vanished, not because downtown interests lost interest, but because they recognized something important. Harlem was not undefended. It had a strategist, and strategists are far more dangerous than loud men with weapons. From that night forward, expansion into Harlem required greater caution, more negotiation, more respect. The message had been delivered. Territory is not always defended with gunfire. Sometimes it is defended with understanding and the willingness to act quietly. If understanding is ignored, The true power of that moment was not in steel. It was in silence. When Bumpy Johnson revealed the razor, he did not create chaos. He created gravity. The entire room seemed to lean toward the small glint of polished metal reflecting chandelier light. No sudden movement, no shouting, no dramatic threats, just control. The mobster across the table had expected resistance, perhaps even confrontation. But confrontation is loud. It is predictable. It gives both sides something to push against. This was different. Bumpy did not challenge him publicly. He did not insult him back. He did not even acknowledge the insult directly. Instead, he reframed the moment. The razor remained closed in his hand. That detail mattered. It was not drawn for attack. It was displayed as possibility. Possibility is more powerful than action. A gun would have turned the club into a battlefield. Men would have reached for weapons. Panic would have spread. Police would have arrived. Headlines would have followed. And headlines weakened strategy. But a razor suggested something far more intimate. It said, "Consequences do not need witnesses." Some say Bumpy leaned forward slightly, lowering himself just enough so that only the mobster could hear his voice. Others insist no words were exchanged at all, that the silence itself carried the full weight of the message. What mattered was the calculation happening behind the mobster's eyes. He was not a fool. He understood territory politics. He understood optics. He understood that escalating over a nightclub insult could create complications. Far beyond Harlem not he had backing.
Yes.
But backing fades when decisions become inconvenient. In that suspended moment, he weighed his options, push forward and risk a confrontation that downtown families might not support publicly, retreat and preserve broader interests. Bumpy allowed him time to make that choice. That was the brilliance of it. He did not force a decision through aggression. He presented reality and let the other man step back on his own. Across the room, the band remained frozen. Duke Ellington sat at the piano, hands resting lightly on the keys. He did not intervene. He did not stand. He understood the language being spoken, even if it involved no words, because this was not about music anymore. It was about sovereignty. The mobster's smirk began to fade, slowly, not dramatically, just enough for those closest to him to notice. His men adjusted in their seats, subtle tension in their shoulders. They were prepared for noise, for gunfire, for a brawl. They were not prepared for stillness. Stillness unnerves men who rely on intimidation. Bumpy's face revealed nothing. No anger, no excitement, no satisfaction. He did not blink first. Some legends claim he quoted a line of poetry, under his breath, something about respect and consequence. Others dismiss that as embellishment, added later to elevate the myth. Whether he spoke or remained silent, the effect was undeniable. The mobster leaned back in his chair, hands visible, a small nod. A surrender without the word surrender ever being spoken. That was the turning point. Not explosive, not theatrical, but decisive. Bumpy held the razor a second longer, just enough to ensure the image would settle into memory. Witnesses would replay it later. They would tell it in whispers. They would exaggerate certain details and forget others, but the essence would remain. Harlem had answered. And then he folded the razor closed. The metallic click, soft as it was, sounded louder than any gunshot in that suspended room. He slipped it back into his coat pocket. No victory speech. No dramatic exit, just a slight nod toward the stage. That nod carried instruction. Ellington resumed playing. The piano returned first, cautious at first, then confident. The horns followed. The rhythm rebuilt itself, stronger than before. The crowd exhaled. Collectively, laughter did not return to the mobster's table. The night moved forward, but something had shifted, permanently. The razor had never been opened, it had never been used, and that was precisely why it mattered, because real power does not need demonstration, it needs recognition. That evening became more than a confrontation. It became a lesson delivered without chaos. Harlem's boundaries were intact. Its culture remained uninterrupted. And every man in that room walked away understanding a simple truth. Some territories are protected not by noise, but by men who know exactly when silence is enough.